Yes. I have a couple points I want to make. I'll try to keep them very short.
Please identify yourself.
Stephen Platzer.
Yeah.
First point, talking about historical memory, today being May 4th, I think today's also the 37th anniversary of Penn State, is that right? Since we're bringing that stuff up. Right. I want to talk about the Japanese paper. I had a lot of problems with it. The paper was presented in terms of context, and since that, I don't know if the written paper, at least the presentation today, so I'll just talk about what I heard today. And the context was framed in terms of the struggle between left and right at different moments in Japanese post-war history. I think the real context has to be between the pre-war period and the post-war period, and that it's not simply between different political groups, but it's between the state and society. Now, if you go and you look at the pre-war period, the principle of education in the pre-war state was that there was a distinction made between what was called scholarship, which was referred to as what those of us in the universities do, and education. And education exists for the sake of the state. There are two standards of truth. In the universities, it's between right and wrong, or between, if you will, truth and falsehood. Whereas in education, the standard is between what's good and bad for the state. And that was the standard upon which pre-war education was based. After the war, the American attempt to reform education, to democratize, was to eliminate that power, to take that power away from the state and vest that power in the hands of the people, where people at the local levels would choose their own textbooks. There would be no government control, no government censorship whatsoever. When you start your story in the 1950s, by that point the government had already, with the help of the politicians, but not simply by the politicians themselves, the Ministry of Education was in the process of regaining its power to reinstitute that distinction between scholarship and education. And that's what I think the struggle has really been about. In other words, that the state has a particular vision, and its vision is what it calls its mission in the world, its world historical mission. And it's very interesting, you're talking about that certain right-wing historians who were brought back in to act as censors. Well, there were a particular group of philosophers at Kyoto University who were purged after the war because of their active involvement in a wartime ideology about Japan's world historical mission to lead the East Asian world beyond modernity, beyond the West. These particular individuals were brought back and inserted at the very center of the educational system. One of them became the chief textbook censor. He himself, with nobody else's permission, he had the right to control every textbook which was allowed in Japan. And he was doing it on the basis of this pre-war vision and this wartime notion of Japan's world historical mission. By the 1960s, then, after this power had been reinvested within the state, the textbooks are written on the basis of a textbook curriculum committee, which has a document which it's all based upon called The Image of a Desirable Human Being, which is written by another one of these Kyoto philosophers, in which they expand upon Japan's world historical mission. And that's what's going on in these textbooks. In other words, I think you have to see it in terms of the struggle with the state's attempt to redefine the nation and to control thought on the basis of this distinction between truth and what's good for the state. And when you look at it that way, I think that it's a much more complicated. And if you want to really look at a Frankenstein monster, of education, Japan exists.
Let's first perhaps collect a few.
Who was that? Stephen.
Or is there nobody else who wants to intervene? Yes.
I actually have a point, but I would actually like, since it's so different, I don't want to intervene because it's not so it doesn't contribute.
Well, no, let's
okay,
just collect, and our panelists can then summarize.
Okay, I wanted to get to the last point about international standards and the way in which universalism and particularism actually developed from this kind of, or as it is being viewed through the textbook controversies. And I think that one thing that we haven't had the full slate, but I think that if I can anticipate, what we see a fairly homogeneous universal standard of what good pedagogy is, what good morals are, what are the standards that we want, whether it is gender or other components of a good history, etc. So on the one hand, we have a great deal of call for regionalism, localism, particularism, as well the essence and closer to people. On the other hand, we have this universal standard. So the tension between universality and culture becomes very evident in a very different ways. And that, I think, that the end, sort of the questions of whether that actually enhances sort of global capitalism or undermine global capitalism, whether we have a different content of progress, but the same notions of progress of where what we do, none of us is trying to do an inferior product to what has been done before. We all try to do something that is better, so the content differs, but the progress as a structure is actually very much instituted in this kind of a frame. But I guess that's sort of, as an opening, might be enough for me.
Okay.
I was really interested to hear your argument about the unchangeability of the past, that it is being written in granite. I think it was very much also a psychological argument that you made, and I found it very interesting. But very often we hear now the very opposite, namely that whereas in the past the future was something that was expected to change, now it is no longer the future, but it's the past, that we are all ready to accept that it is changing all of the time. Now, some of the reasons for this changing of the past, which is a really new phenomenon, is, of course, the change of political systems. And this in Central Europe is a clear case, and we can see it after the fall of the wall everywhere. That's very obvious. But there are also other reasons for the changing of the past, and that is also the change of generations, perhaps, in countries that do not have a systems change, and also the pure erosion, maybe, of ideology. So how would you respond to those motivations for change or reasons for change, even in countries that do not have a systems change, for a change?
Okay, I perhaps should say this was Lazar Barkan, and this was Professor Aleda Assmann. Hannah Schissler.
I would like to take issue with you, Professor Engaro. First of all, I certainly love the title, I guess, like everybody did in this room. Now, you make a link. I mean, it is obvious that writing for schools has to be selective, as any writing of history is. Now, you make a very convincing case for the instrumentalization of the kind of selection that is being made in school textbooks for the regime, whatever it is. And you argue that with authoritarian or even autocratic regimes, they can change things from the top down, as we have seen. Now, what is really, I mean, I would like to hear some more thoughts from you on what you say about the textbooks in the ways they select and the ways they keep omitting uncomfortable facts for the nation state, what this says about the democratic process, because that's very unsettling, obviously. That is one question that I have, and I clearly can follow your argument and can see where you come from. The second question that I have is also for you. The international NGOs, the international community has tried, especially in Central Europe after 1989, because of the resurgence of nationalisms, to be helpful, to intervene. Frequently it had the outlook of some kind of benign imperialism, but imperialism it was nevertheless. And I would like to hear your opinion on these kinds of interventions, especially coming from Western Europe.
I also have a question, mostly concerning the Japanese paper, and what I find just simply difficult to understand, given the similar but quite different German history, is the extraordinary investment in the nation. And why the extraordinary investment in the nation is resolved the way it is in a It's essentially a repetition and re-articulation of a national imperial narrative. Now, I wouldn't say that the German narrative is so fundamentally different. It's very underhandedly national as well. But clearly, what the German narrative and what the German textbooks show is that you can go in many ways to achieve, as it were, not the same, but similar ends. And that difference of a repetition of the past, as it were, as opposed to a reinvention of the past in the process of distancing in this case. I mean, in the German case, you put your entire purchase into the distancing from that past in order only to get at other pasts, like Heinemann, democratic past, etc., which there is a good Japanese tradition as well, right? So, I never quite understood what the logic of it is, and this logic, in a way, is important for all the kinds of nationalizing cases, because they must not necessarily go the way we heard they go in a number of Eastern and Western European nations. Of course, here the case of France would have been quite important to remind us of grand nationalizing histories. Second problem is, I find it difficult, this is a question really concerning Niladri, to compare kind of the national histories of Japan with the national histories of India and, say, China. Because we just deal with such different entities. I mean, you deal with relatively small countries. Not necessarily homogeneous countries, not by any by a long shot, but certainly not the kind of deeply multi-ethnic imperial countries, if you wish, that you deal in the Indian case and the Chinese case and other cases. Once we get over into Latin America, this will become clear too. And I wondered whether we can really reduce the problem to one of national histories, and whether we do not have to keep in mind the frame that we are talking about, that is, Japanese and German frame and other such frames are one thing, the frames of these great imperial Russian, Chinese, Indian, and Brazilian history is a slightly different, it's just a different vantage point. And in this context, of course, I mean, the equivalent for what you discussed for Indian history would indeed be some kind of European history. That would be the scope. And of course, there is a European narrative, which we then European histories have to challenge, which is the narrative of Western civilization, right? Sorry.
Coming on the top of Michael's question, last week, quick question to Niladri, which is that, if you ended by saying that your committee's provisional solution to the problems of past historiography, in textbook writing, was to foreground criticality, that everything was looked at critically. And my question is, how do you ensure then that these books also allow the children who read the books, or young people who read the books, to look at criticality itself critically, so that criticality does not become another hardened prejudice, which sort of then it kind of stands for some kind of absolute truth, that social constructionism is the only truth against the fact that, against the point that everything else is constructed but not social constructionism.
Yeah, I'm Ray Arsenault. I have a question similar to that for all the panelists. Thinking about this disjunction between scholarship and education, which was mentioned a few moments ago. And I'm curious, in these other countries that you're discussing, if you have something equivalent to what Francis Fitzgerald, who did the first kind of analysis of American textbooks in America Revised, about the complicity of teachers and educational administrators and textbook commissions in terms of this notion of levels of cognition. In other words, that K through 12 children cannot handle the truth. Fitzgerald argues that we treat K through 12 children as if they're mentally ill, and that uses that term. And I just wonder how much of a problem that is in other nations as well, independent of the problems of nationalism, but just kind of assumptions about the social psychology of children. I know where I teach, I'm a visiting professor here right now, but in Florida, we have a state senator, Michael Fasano, who passed a law last year outlawing interpretive history from K through 12. It was buried in a larger bill, and people were trying to ignore it, but essentially said no interpretation K through 12, just the facts.
One more question, yes?
Okay, along with the critical thinking point, that the element I want to mention is about the examination system, because ultimately, for each kid, I assume generally in the world, the primary function of learning knowledge from the text is to score higher in certain entrance exam. And so I would suggest that when we talk about the textbook, we should also consider the examination system, because if the examination system was controlled by the state or certain authority, then that means the knowledge a kid learned from the textbook should be reconfirmed through the exam. So whether or not you're patriotic enough, whether or not you're critical enough would be examined by the exam. The text will be evaluated through certain examination. And precisely the critical thinking is the crucial debate or issue that raised several years ago when Taiwan had a new version of history textbook. It's that from 1945 to 2000, we only have one version as the official textbook. So all Taiwanese were familiar with one version of historical narrative. But in 2000, we have a new version because now it's a democratic society of so and so on. So the government opened up, and suddenly they have 7 different versions of textbook, though they were all written following by the same guideline. But the project I was involved in is the examination system. We had a really difficult time to come up with the questions that for the college entrance exam. And because one of the purpose of this kind of multi-narrative of history, of national history, one of the functions is to develop the critical thinking of high school students. And one evaluation is whether or not they have critical thinking. But the problem is, if this is the exam, then there will be only one correct answer. Or a correct answer would be more practical than an open-ended. Otherwise, it's hard to evaluate a critical, whether or not this is a critical thinking or whether or not this is the independent thinking. So I think then that poses a lot of problems. So I'm just simply suggest that we
One
should
very
do
last
that.
question.
My name is Taeju Kim. I'm in the Department of History. I have 2 questions, very simple. And one question is goes to Professor Uchiko. You divided that the history debates into three periods: 1955 and 1979 and 1995. And I want to ask you why this 3 period around 1955 and 79 and 95, those history textbook debate was so important in the context of Japanese society, about nations and whatever, and politically. And then second question goes to Professor Salvan, and why this history textbook debate was not as much as important as now during the Cold War period, and now it became the cottage industry in international society.
Okay. Very important questions. Great variety of them. Please, in the order you wish.
We should probably keep it short.
Keep it short. I think the first question about the raised by Stephen Pratt, and I don't think I would disagree. And in other writings, I have some issues dealt with. And actually, in this paper also, we talked a little bit about the question of science in history from the pre-surrender period to the contemporary issues. So there are always Minister of Education saying that this text is too scientific, meaning that Mark also talked about a little bit, to write as if it is a historical novel. So historical novel is the sort of, the paradigm we had, especially wartime period. So, and also the post-war history textbook authors had a hard time to break from that tradition to write much more empirical history in the textbooks. But at the same time, Minister of Education is always talking about writing about more romantic ways, or to write. So I think in the bottom line, I don't disagree with that. But at the same time, the focus of this particular paper is to provide answer to the Michael's question: why so it is recurrent, and I try to explain it because it is we omitted the international context about it, but there are some internal politics within the ruling party, and whenever there is a disarray in the ruling political bloc, some nationalists got united and to attack textbooks. And then also there are real political issues Japan faces about the constitution. And then whenever the debate over the constitution deadlocked, the attack became the textbooks. So basically textbooks is a sort of substituting side of political struggle. Rather than talking about deadlock issues of constitutionality of they started, nationalists got together to attack textbooks. That was 3 times repeated history. I don't know from this one we can draw any sensitive conclusion, but I just wanted to provide that. And underneath of it, it is always question of how we write a history, and our Japanese people had a difficult to break from the historical novel paradigm is exactly that is the myth of the popular myth. And actually, 1970s, but very courageous educators tried to teach war atrocities Japan committed to the student, but what they got from the parents were not sure about it. One thing they were not taught about like that. Secondly, basically there are grassroots populism and nationalism, which really argue. It's not an argument, but it's a sentiment or a feeling against teaching about the cosmopolitan version of Japanese history. So that's I know. So in that sense, I don't disagree. Okay, this.
Yes. Any?
Yes.
I'm told we have to go to lunch at 1:20, so
Not at 1:20.
Okay, so I'm allowed 3 minutes.
Quite far from here.
First, I also welcome Platzer's point. I think it is useful for us to look at the return of key figures, including those from the Kyoto School and others, and we can look at from this angle. But I also don't see the major break. It seems to me much of the post-war system is the pre-war system, first under American control and later returning to Japanese hands. In terms of Michael's point, I'm not sure there's an answer to why the difference, but some of the whys that strike me as important are the different post-war histories of Germany and Japan, starting with the fact that the United States kept Hirohito on the throne. And this made it extremely difficult for Japanese to re-examine their history of imperialism, war, and war atrocities, particularly prior to his death. He managed to stay on the throne until 1989, when he finally kicked off. And this put tremendous constraint. By contrast, and And with that, the continuity of Japanese governments from pre-war to post-war. In Germany, the German government always had a powerful interest in distancing itself from fascism, as I read that early history. And
1918 tried but didn't succeed.
Well, anyhow, this is a quick seat of the pants attempt to put something on the table, at least that we can come back to. Why was the text debate more important in the last 15 decades, Mr. Kim, 15 years? Mr. Kim asks. A very short answer there, I think, also is a point slightly buried in our presentation, and that is that the textbook issues moved from issues central to the Japanese debate, they moved to the international arena. And this gave a much higher profile and much greater intensity. When Japanese nationalists say we have to write our own texts and we have to take pride in it, and we're not writing for Chinese or Koreans or some other aliens, this raises the temperature, and it also means that the press internationally follows the issues much more closely.
Three questions. One is the question of universal and the particular, and whether writing textbooks in this form is always embedded in a process where certain universalistic ideas begin to shape the project, and whether this actually, in some sense, strengthens the logic of global capital. I think it would depend a lot on how we think of the local and how we think of any of these universalizing pressures that you're talking about, gender history, local history, a variety of things. I don't think there is anything intrinsic to this tension between the local and the global, which necessarily implies that it gets integrated to the logic of capital. It can, but it need not necessarily be. It would depend on how we actually insert ourselves within that process. And I think it is possible to think of this tension between the opposing thing as a productive tension which can be actually played upon in order to both critique the process of state formation, global capital, as well as allow us to distance ourselves from it. But ultimately we cannot get away, in some sense, from global capital. We are all part of that process. The question of national units and territories, comparison between China and India. I think what I was trying to suggest is that then we need not necessarily think of doing history within frameworks of reference where national entities are always the entities through which we look at history. It is important to look at national histories in some sense, but equally to break out of that. And therefore, what we try to do in many of our textbooks is to organize and frame histories in terms of possibly themes, where we move from one region to another in order to discuss the theme of industrialization. You move from Britain to America to India to Japan, a variety. So you think of industrialization rather than think of Japanese industrialization. But the local variations and a variety of ways in which, whether it is agriculture, industry, travel, forest, various things come in, those can be worked out and thought about. So what we are questioning is the inevitable, whether we need to inevitably see territories and nation as the unit of inquiry, and we shouldn't do that. Finally, the point about criticality. Of course, if we fetishize criticality, it can become a problem. But I think unpacking things and allowing a child to question the world within which they live is something which can help them define their relationship to the world in interesting ways. But criticality is not a theme which we explicitly articulate in the text. It's a way of how you bring in different narratives and juxtapose in order to produce a truth. It is not so open-ended. There is a particular way in that juxtaposition happens. I'll stop.
Yes, I think I see 4 questions here I'll try to answer, beginning with Virginia's question about when did the conservatives get mobilized to put a brake on changing interpretations of history. I think 2 things. One, when they're feeling threatened, and I think certainly in the context of the United States, I think we could talk about the way in which the great conservative reaction of the last generation was inspired by the perception of a threat over a period of the last half century, and also when people are grieving. In the region in Central Europe, people, it's hard for them to empathize and to be receptive to change that's self-critical when they still themselves feel like they're victims. And so I think the process of grief is one of the things that makes it more difficult in some areas. My own experience is that the greatest victims, in the case of Yugoslavia, the Albanians and the Bosnians, are the most difficult to convince that they have these contentious narratives. Changes I'd like to speak with you maybe in between meetings, maybe over lunch, about examples of change, because building on this earlier point, my sense is that if systems are still in place and there is change, that it comes from a greater sense of security. I look at the Poles' recognition of the expulsion of 45 or something as maybe an indication of the degree to which Poles feel more and more secure about their own identity and existence. But I'd like to talk about that. One thing is maybe we've cast our nets in different parts of the ocean here. I'm catching fish that talk about resistance to change, but there are also fish out there that are showing, and so we don't want to be blanket by saying there is no change or there is a lot of change. The way in which the ministries in most of the Yugoslav successor states, certainly, they have competitions and then they authorize some books for adoption. The problem is, like in Serbia, for example, the Ministry of Science is controlled by the DSS, which is a non-fascist, extreme nationalistic party, very nationalistic party. And so it's very difficult if you're getting into those kinds of books that counter that. You have to get through that filter. One of the problems in Serbia that talks about this control, it's a very centralized, very much a French model of government that Serbia has had since the 19th century, is in the region of Vojvodina, which is the northern part, which is very multi-ethnic and has a tremendous tradition of multi-ethnic tolerance and sees itself as Western as Croats do in Croatia. Nonetheless, the ministry in Belgrade dictates that basically the only faculty hired at the university are going to be nationals, and the department is not going to study things like multi-ethnicity. And the Vojvodina provincial government is constantly locked; they can't get the money to change with that. So, something I overlooked in my talk is that when Milosevic comes to power, he comes to power on a surge of popular demand, popular feeling, and he's able to overthrow this sort of communist era unity and brotherhood very effortlessly. Finally, about the ministries, local control is a prescription of course, having further accountability to democratic forces, to forces at the local level. I know in school districts they want local control so they can make sure that their curriculum, their textbooks are adopted. It reminds me in American history of the way in which the southern states had book adoption at the state level, which maximized the number of sales, and how we minimized our coverage of the positives of U.S. Reconstruction after the Civil War and minimized the horrors of the KKK and things like that because Texas and Alabama and the southern states so controlled it that there was a market that had that you could address if you went soft on slavery and you talked about the war between the states instead of the Civil War. Finally, on interventions, what I find in the region is that there is a small number of liberals who are very positively inclined towards what the international community is trying to do because we are their allies, but that there is resentment by the majority of people about this Western intervention. In the project that I run called the Scholars Initiative, what we have tried to do is short-circuit that by getting native scholars to take the lead in writing their own history in collaboration with scholars from other parts of the region who were formerly enemies. And then if native scholars put their names on it, then you overcome the resistance to what Soros or the U.S. State Department, whatever they're doing. And I frequently hear the refrain, well, we'd love you to do this, but we don't want our fingerprints on it because it'll be discredited. if Western governments are seen as inspiring. So local ownership is, I think, important, and it's there. They have to have the courage to step forward.
No, I think
Okay,
I think we should.
let me just remind you there are two questions that I think are generally open. That is the question of international standards on one hand, because I think that's a big issue, not just universal standards. And the second thing that also concerns me is the question of the examination system and the fact that all these school books are there for credentialing and hence set standards. And how do you set standards while doing criticality? It's a very intriguing and very profoundly difficult problem, and we will convene again at 1:20.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have two problems here, not just one. First, this afternoon session overthrew everything that we said this morning. Effectively, we went one direction this morning, and now that we move to the supra-regional, integrational history as the new challenge, America as a global power, Mexico and the United States as a common space of communication, as maybe, as a common space, Europe as an integrated space, and in the background I had in my mind the thing you didn't talk about, South Asia as a common space, which is of course a little more than India. Not much more, but that kind of that is a genuinely flustering proposition. It's obviously, well, add to
Is
this.
everything thrown off? Why is everything thrown off from the mornings?
Well, because we seem to settle all the problems this morning.
I noticed that everything was settled.
we open up everything. But this the second problem is in opening up a bit. Okay. In opening up the debate this afternoon, we literally ate up all the time we had class. So I'm a little nonplussed what to do. I would like to have a discussion.
Sure, we should have about it.
We should have a discussion, and then we simply have to, well, as they say, soldier on.
How about 1 minute each for each discussant? I mean, each question.
Okay.
If you
Short questions.
Okay. Yeah. I think I don't agree that it's totally different. I think one thing we have to do is define what Europe is. Simone talking about Europe, the EU is a different Europe than what has not entered or is just entered the EU. I will remind you that Europe was defined by Peter the Great, who decided to construct maps with the Urals as the official border. There are those of us Central Europeans who feel the EU represents a different type of Europe. And I think Simone's making the point, in the 19th century, the Italians and the Germans, for example, and then earlier, the Western Europeans had a much less secure sense of what nationhood was. And as this sort of feud has moved east, the Eastern Europeans now are still insecure about their identity, but a lot of the things that Italians and Germans were insecure about 150 years ago, they now are more secure now. I think we have to look at this as something that's in time as well as in space. But anyway, I'm not to rebut you.
Yeah, and I don't want to rebut you.
There's actually, I guess, a discussion taking place. Maybe I should let other people get in the discussions. I actually have two questions about the panelists. I have two questions for the panelists.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name is Jose Barlema, I'm a graduate student here, and I wanted to thank Crescentia for putting this together. I've learned a lot. I guess I have two questions, or one's probably a comment, one's a question regarding 1848. And I know that Mauricio was quoting from Tom Bender regarding the question of that the Americans wanted the Mexican territory without the Mexicans there. However, don't you think that needs to be sort of looked at maybe geographically in areas where, for instance, Euro-Americans overwhelmed the Mexican population, like in Texas and California? There they might have had a choice, but in a place like New Mexico, where the Mexican-American population remained the majority well into the 1930s, in fact, I think that would be a bit different. They had to contend with the Mexicans. In fact, in just some recent research, it's been suggested that when the Repatriation Commission, after the end of U.S.-Mexican War, was sent to Mexico to bring back the Mexicans, they were stopped by the American authorities. Why? Because, of course, they need numbers to then lobby the Congress to get a state. Right.
And not only that, I mean, I think there was some compatibility there. I mean, the U.S. Outlawed slavery in 1862. New Mexico doesn't outlaw slavery until 1868 because they wanted to keep their indigenous slaves. So that's one point I think is important to point out, that I think, don't you think that needs to be looked at more geographically or regionally, right? Because ultimately, sort of following on what Mauricio was saying, there are some sort of Western compatibilities between some of these Northern Mexicans and Euro-Americans. My second question, just very briefly, is Mauricio mentioned Samuel P. Huntington and the whole idea about the Reconquista. And my question is, don't you think that that aspect itself needs to be historicized? Because, in fact, I mean, what we're seeing now is that people like Samuel P. Huntington, these sorts of anti-Mexican sorts of books are arising at a very particular historical moment. You did not see these things, for instance, in the 1940s or 50s. I mean, nowadays you have 2 books by Buchanan, right? You have Samuel P. Huntington. You have 2 congressmen, right? Tom Tancredo, J.T. Hayward, that are ultimately arguing the same sort of Reconquista line. And by the same token, the Mexican intelligentsia, right, is only recently taken an interest in those Mexicans abroad. I mean, in fact, the earliest book that they actually wrote about migration was in 1929, and then there wasn't any more published up until the 1960s with the rise of the Chicano movement. So don't you think that the whole idea of the Reconquista itself needs to be historicized, and to see, for instance, the rise of somebody like Huntington at a particular historical juncture, which is a response to this incredible increased influx of Mexican immigrants that has only taken place since the 1980s?
Well, your first question, I think it's a very good point. I think the space does make some difference. In Texas and New Mexico, we're very different places. And I guess I should take a closer look at all that. I was mostly relying on a lot of the rhetoric of the time, and the rhetoric of the time is powerfully anti-Catholic as much as it is an issue of skin color. I mean, neither one quality were much wanted. I also think, though I don't know the exact figures, and you may, that the totals of people in New Mexico was generally pretty small, even whatever their proportion of Mexican and Anglos. And I think that was less of an issue. But certainly to go all the way, the real issue was whether to go all the way to Mexico City or not. And that's where they pull back. And that would have been the heart of Mexico. But the other question, I believe, is for you.
No, totally agree. The only problem, the only thing I would say what you say, we shouldn't be emphasizing that Mexicans come in the 1980s. When we emphasize just because of the input of Mexicans, because the 1980s, Mexicans have been here, Mexicans were here, Mexicans have been here, always here. If we keep talking about the 1980s, like the new debate and everything, always, if you go to the 1880s, I have found quotes against Mexicans and quotes in favor of Mexicans, depending on the economic, political circumstances. If you go to the 1860s, the 1870s, in the wars, Manuel Gonzalez tried to bring Mexican back, and the Americans don't want it back because they need the labor force. If you go to the 1920s, you say that Mexicans didn't worry about it. I have a student of mine going, and I asked him to go to the main list of Mexican intellectuals from the 1880s and 1920s. No single one did not mention that Mexicans were leaving. Like good arbitristas of the 17th century in Spain, they were worried that Mexico was not rich because people were leaving. So I agree totally with you, we can history forever, but not starting that the Mexican problem is NAFTA and 1980s, because then we defeat ourselves in the food.
Well, just a quick follow-up, if I may. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, I wasn't arguing that the migration was new. I mean, in fact, we know that Mexican migration to the U.S. begins immediately after the gold rush to California in 1849. You have this influx. What I was saying, right, or suggesting, was that this recent wave, the newest, right, not new, but just the newest wave in the 1980s, has provided the structural conditions for the emergence of people like Huntington, Pat Buchanan, and the likes. I mean, I think a much more position would be, right, not about the Reconquista, but in fact that territory, of the territories, was not Mexico's to sell to begin with. It was in fact Comanche land, or Apache land, or Pueblo land, or Kiowa land. It wasn't even Mexico's to sell, but they had never been able to sell it. I think that would be a much more radical position, don't you agree?
Yes, but I'm not, remember what I say about the importance of oblivion. If we keep talking about the origins, and what are the original, nothing will be solved.
Could I say something about Buchanan and the intellectuals? That's the other part of my work, the intellectuals, okay? I think actually that that a lot of the emergence of a Samuel Huntington and a Buchanan has to do with, well, maybe I'll back up. There's a great correlation in American history of rises of nativism with loss of confidence. And there was a tremendous loss of national confidence in the 1970s with the oil crisis that everybody thought Toyotas have overcome, but they thought they were going to overcome. Then the death of Vincent Chin in Chicago because it was Chinese attacked and killed thinking he was Japanese. It would have been okay if he was Japanese in Detroit. Yeah. So there was this sense that we were losing it somehow. The other thing that I think motivated a lot of this was part of the Chicano movement and bilingualism and things like this. This silly thing, I think. I mean, as even Arthur Schlegelner said, who wrote against multiculturalism, he says the idea that people who come to America aren't going to learn English. He says the whole world is learning English. Why would the people who are coming here be the only ones who don't? But anyway, there were a lot of internal things, I think, that were probably more important than the quantitative numbers, although the numbers increasing were certainly an issue.
Very quickly, I've got about a dozen huge questions that I'm trying to process from Mauricio's presentation, but here are a few of them to maybe put on the table. If the past and the future is a past and a future common history, isn't this NAFTA? Second, not that I don't like the concept, I think it's very exciting to try to think this through. Doesn't mean the same thing for Americans and Mexicans. It's clear to me that the past and the future of the Mexican historical experience is a common history of the United States. It's not clear to me what that means for the United States. In other words, we're talking about a superpower and a neighboring power. So what are the implications of your thesis for how we think about American history as opposed to how we think about Mexican history? And the final one I'm fascinated by, but I guess I still don't quite get the power of your claim that race is the core of the paradox. Why race? What is the racial difference that racial stereotype? Yes, but of course we Americans are this polyglot mix of races getting more mixed up all the time. What does it mean? What is actually the claim about race as the same? Wonderful stuff, I must
present it to you. Maybe you should answer that.
Well, first,
it's a very different question.
Okay. The question of NAFTA. No, NAFTA is precisely what I it's the consolidation of the belief in the existence of two civilizations that nevertheless can exchange merchandise.
That's the premise.
During the NAFTA negotiations, in the Mexican side, which I was involved, because they wanted somebody who knew something history, how to sell this. I have a good historical facade, so they invited Canadians and Mexicans to say something. Was specifically said, no mention of free circulation of bodies of citizens, because then we don't get NAFTA. We don't get NAFTA pass. That's what I say. The European case is an interesting, not because it's wonderful, not because it's everything. It's our epochal example of an exercise in which you can sit Germans, Spaniards, and French in the table and make all the mistakes you want, but at least they are accepting that we also include bodies in the table, citizens. We also accept a common citizenship, which has never been even remotely mentioned in the Mexican-American case. We can talk about immigration reform, legalizing, whatever. A common citizenship, no way. Not now. I'm talking about 50 years from now. We have this, we have that, we have that. You know, who is the main promoter of Turkey's incorporation to the European Union? The United States. But his own private Turkey doesn't even mention. So NAFTA is completely not the case. It's not even the symbol that Mexico integrated. It just did legalize what it was already there. I mean, NAFTA is no. Now, yes, that is at the core of my situation, of my thinking. It's very easy to although I have not been able to convince Mexicans that it is very important to study American history and to incorporate American history in Mexico, it is not difficult to convince them that the U.S. is very important in American history, in Mexican history.
Of course.
When and if I convince them whether they will accept to do this, I have my doubts. Now, for Americans, I'm sure if I convince them, they will do, because as I was telling Professor Benter, it is the Americans who had opened a window. Not a lot, but 4 or 5 who asked me, let's think about it. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So let's think about it. Mexicans don't even want to talk about it. They realized and are aware that the U.S. is fundamentally Mexican history, that there is no Mexican history without the U.S. But they don't want to talk about any kind of experiment. Now, I would say that the way to go and make Americans understand that Mexico is more or as important as the issue of slavery, as England and all those things in their history, there are 2 ways. The first one is to avoid the problem of power, because as American history show, okay, we are the omnipower. Why should we worry about these poor people, these poor Mexicans? Well, for the same reason that Vietnam defeated them, for the same reason that they cannot defeat Iran. There is weapons of the weak. We are too many. So they are might as well, even if they are so powerful, the moment they put a Mexican equals a terrorist, we are lost. And I go back to Europe. I don't want to use the European case as a goodwill. Europe was made possible by we have killed each other enough. The Soviet Union, and let's see what we can do. Okay? Well, before we get to that point, can we sit in the table and say to Americans, yes, you are all very powerful, nobody, of course, it's much more important Jamestown than those Mexicans over there. I mean, Washington, of course, don't even mention, no, Mexico is nothing in your history. But if you don't see us, it could become a real problem. So, if the power issue could be solved by saying, yes, we're weak. It's not the same power. There is an imbalance. But we are lost and you are lost. You win, we win. Now, the intellectual is more exciting for me. That is how to prove to them that it's not for 1848 the interesting thing about Mexico. Is that in American intellectual, political, and economic history throughout the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century, we are linked. That is easy to accept to Mexicans, but it's very easy to define yourself from the War of 1812. Only until very recently, the very important Mexican-American War is becoming important in national history of the United States. The importance it had in creating the generation of generals, the nationalistic ideology that created this nation after during Reconstruction. You just have to convince the students that Mexico, it sounds awful, but it's as England. You have to have it present as, That's what I mentioned Hollinger. For him, who is very smart and I respect him a lot, it's very easy to say England, or it's very easy to say Europe, or even it's very easy to say with all the feeling of guilt, slavery. But not Mexico. Mexico is secondary, they are always here. Finally, race. Race is it's not that I think it's a reason, and I accept that, it's just that I think it's a very important, it's the way it has been seen. I think that at the root of our civilizational barrier, if you think that these are 2 Christian peoples, have been Spain and France. Yes, there are Native Americans, they are indigenous people in Mexico, but this is exactly the same history, this is exactly the same kind of people. And nevertheless, as Professor Bender shows, and many others who have used this as an example, the Americans were in Mexico City. The American flag was in the National Palace. You took the best, why don't take the rest? There are a lot of brown people. You can discuss as much as you want about New Mexico, but but 5 million, 10 million Mexicans, brown people, what are you going to do with it? Now, we don't think that way now, but think of the very issue of Latinos. The very issue, the way we talk about Latinos, race, Mexicans, it's always racially marked, for good or bad. We believe on that. We just believe on that.
Okay. I think we should move to the next session. I can bring up.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.